be able to vote on them in a referendum. I'm talking about here, well, how many houses and where they go. So as you can see, the Localism Act has quite a lot of serious implications for us, providing we can get back to the beginning of it. At the moment, we're on the end of a process that hasn't been done correctly. And now you can see the reason why it is that I have put speed at the heart of what we're trying to achieve here. Because if we allow this council to continue the way it is, to bring in some of these freedoms and flexibilities, we could be waiting a very, very long time. And certainly the local plan will have gone through and will be enacted. If we can do it fast enough, we can stop the local plan in its tracks and start again employing the correct principles, the new powers given to us under a new organisation that we have more accountability of, and according to the planning policy framework that was set down by the government, which this lot haven't even, as far as I can see, read, let alone abided by. So far what we have is a local plan which is lazy, it's insulting and downright condescending to the people of Thanet. It takes away our rights, our newfound freedoms under the law, and it therefore needs to be stopped as soon as possible. And there's no better way to stop it than to get rid of the two authorities who actually perpetrated this insult in the first place. I'd like to see these newfound powers and planning guidelines used to the benefit of Thanet under a new system of government based on a Thanet Unitary Authority. So returning now briefly to the story of unitaries. Unitaries were first created in the 1990s. They're constituted by the Local Government Act 1992, and there was a further review in 2009 which resulted in several more of them being formed. There's now 55 of them in existence in total, not including the 32 London boroughs and 36 metropolitan boroughs, which all execute similar powers to unitaries, but they're not called unitaries because they have different origins. Of these 55, 23 are controlled by Labour, 19 by Conservatives, 1 by Lib Dems, and 12 under no overall control. In the case of the 55 unitaries, some were created by the counties taking over all the districts, as in the smaller counties, and some were created by the districts breaking away from the county, which is what happened in Medway, and of course what would happen here. My favourite is Torbay. The reason for that is it is a smallish unitary authority. It's about the same size as what will be here in Thanet, in Devon. It has an elected council leader, Gordon Oliver, and it was, of course, a group of former seaside towns, much like what we've got here. And it actually was beset by most of the problems that we've got here in Thanet, which is not unknown to seaside towns. It's just when you've got three seaside towns in such close proximity, it's devastating, as we have here. And they have the same problem in Torbay. And they've still got some problems they've still got some way to go in Torbay. It's not perfect yet. But Torbay has gone from strength to strength since adopting the elected mayor format in recent years, and it now has inward investment in the next 3 years of over £300 million. And it's become known, as you probably aware, the English Riviera. Now, to achieve the status of unitary authority, there's no standing or accepted procedure. It seems to be varied in each particular case. In Chorley, for example, in Lancashire, which is probably the most recent one I know about, the route has been for the Borough Council to carry out a feasibility study, first of all, on whether it can deliver all the services, which leads to an initial business case, and then that's discussed with neighbouring and county authorities. They put it out to public consultation. The council then makes a decision as to whether they want to go to a unitary. Assuming they do, they have a referendum, and lastly, the whole thing is submitted to the Secretary of State for approval. In the case of Thanet, a strong vote for independence at the general election would trigger and sustain, I believe, this kind of process, particularly if the electorate returned 1 or 2 MPs with this as their sole mandate. It would in effect both accelerate and guarantee the process, especially in the case of a hung parliament in Westminster, or a minority government that might be very anxious about avoiding a by-election in Thanet so soon after a general election. Need I say more? This is called people power and political persuasion. You might call it blackmail, I call it political persuasion. And that's the reason we have such a unique opportunity in May to get rid of TDC quickly. Essentially, we want it fast enough to stop this appalling plan from being rubber stamped. Right, so what new governance are we talking about? Looking at the system of governance for our new Thanet Authority, I can understand perfectly the desire to go back to the old comfortable style of local government, what I call the country club approach to government, where each councillor feels just as important as the next one and gets the same kind of allowances. He or she gets fed an inordinate amount of paperwork and never gets the time to read it. He or she gets, all the councillors, I should say, get involved in a non-stop sequence of long and tedious meetings on each and every subject, with powers of delegation rarely being passed down. It's warm beer, comfy chit-chat for everyone, and the business of government, the stuff about really making decisions on difficult problems that require professional advice and conviction, all those kind of thorny problems, well, that's a bit of an inconvenience, really. The long grass is always more comfortable and attractive. And as long as we all get our bit to say and go home feeling like we've achieved something, even though we haven't, that's okay. That, in my view, is committee-style government. I have experienced it, and to be honest, I almost lost the will to live. No. In committee-style government, the difficult decisions are finally taken, but normally by non-elected council officers. And when they are taken, the system is uniquely designed to make sure that no one is ever held responsible when things inevitably go wrong. And in my view, this would not be a change for the better here in Thanet. What we need is to move forward in time. We need a more modern system, one that will galvanise local decision making so that it becomes more open and transparent about who is taking the decisions, when they're taking them and why they're taking them. And most important of all, we need to be able to work out for ourselves who to re-elect if things go well, or who to vote out if things turn into another dreamland or pleasure armor. In my view, to do this, we need a well-motivated, transparent and open teamwork. And that can only happen with a strong elected leader who is accountable to all the voters in Thanet. But I'm also responsive to the need to have much more community input than currently exists, hence my call for town councils to be given cross-cutting powers of scrutiny, and for properly constituted voluntary and community organisations like the Ramsgate Society or Chamber of Commerce, there are a number of them that qualify for this, they would be given statutory rights or mandatory rights of consultation, where the council have to come and talk to them rather than they go cap in hand to the council. So for the purpose of this evening, I've put together an entirely hypothetical example of what I'm talking about. It is in fact a hybrid system, not between an unelected leader and an old committee system, as has happened in the other 11 councils that have gone back to it, but between an elected leader and a committee system. It's not supposed to be a blueprint, it's just a straw man that encapsulates the principles I've been talking about. In fact, I call this system the elected leader and council committee system, because it actually uses an elected leader in conjunction with committees, in conjunction with councils. And it brings much greater accountability to the electorate and the communities alike. And it also brings much greater vision, direction and fair governance. Humans respond best to other warm-blooded humans, not to faceless, unknown and unapproachable committees. But there is still considerable scope for negotiation here in order to accommodate parties' concerns and issues of practicality. More importantly, this system is entirely within the existing legal constraints, as it does not use anyone other than elected councillors from within the new unitary authority. Ideally, I would also like to include town councillors who are not part of the unitary authority. and I'd like to use them within the scrutiny process. It might still be possible to do that with the new Localism Act, and because the Secretary of State might be willing to waive it through, but I don't yet know. However, if it did require secondary legislation to make that possible, which would undoubtedly slow things down, then I'd suggest we just go forward on a two-phase operation, where the first phase is to work without the non-unitary councillors, because there should be enough to go around anyway to do the scrutiny, and then bring in the non-unitary councillors later once the law has been changed. I'll just go back. I want to explain something, because this is a system which we don't have at the moment. And the important aspects of it are that the elected leader only has those particular items that he or she can decide on him or herself. The rest of the, by the way, that's for negotiation as well. That doesn't have to be categorical. So the executive committee has portfolio holders, and each of those portfolio holders might also be the chairman of subcommittees where we need them. So we've still got the full council subcommittee system streamlined, which is what those devotees of the committee system want. But to balance it, we've got the scrutiny over this side, with full scrutiny going to probably 3 or 4 councillors, and they would then coordinate and get the cross-cutting scrutiny going up from each of the town councils, or in the case of Herne Bay, an area council, an area committee. The important thing here is that you've got 2 safeguards that don't currently exist. First one is the elected leader has to be elected. And that means that he or she has to pay a lot of attention to what these towns are actually saying about his or her policies. At the moment, the leader of our council, she comes and sees us occasionally, but she doesn't need any of the 30,000 votes down here in Ramsgate. So what's going on here is of no interest to him or her. Under this system, he or she would have to pay a lot of attention to what's going on here, because otherwise he wouldn't get the votes in 4 years' time. So that's one safeguard. And the other safeguard is, of course, that the councils themselves have got more powers, and they are looking for the policies from a community point of view, and the community is being better represented within the council. So it's more balanced, a lot more safeguards, and I think in principle this is the kind of arrangement we should be aiming for. So a lot of councils, 17 councils up and down the country have got elected leader, but none of them have yet got this system. And there's no reason under Localism Act 2011 why we shouldn't have this system. It meets the Localism Act completely. And the Act actually encourages us to put forward these kind of ideas. So I don't want to get too bogged down on that, but I will take questions later. And also, Councillor Ian Driver has challenged me to a debate, a public debate, on this very issue of elected leaders, which I welcome, and I'm hoping to have that with him as soon as possible, certainly before the election anyway. He's an advocate of the old committee system, obviously. Right, okay. So whatever system we use in the future, I would, however, pay my respect to the local electorate, and I think as a safeguard it should also be right and proper to subject that to a referendum before we actually go forward with it. I wouldn't want people to think that we're doing it without being consulted. And given Thanet's troubled past with its council leaders, unelected leaders, then I think that would be absolutely necessary. But I'd finally like to make a point that in spite of being in possession of these powers to move away from a non-elected system and cabinet for 8 years now, for 8 years these powers have existed, and the powers and flexibility to propose an alternative system to match local circumstances have been around for 4 years, TDC has in fact done nothing to make themselves more accountable or efficient. One might say this is typical of an organisation that is completely out of touch with the people it governs. It's typical of a government led by someone who does not give a jot about our votes. And they will need to be forced out of their complacency, I believe. So, leadership versus management, very important. Leaders hire managers to make decisions. Leaders have to persuade people. And that's the importance of having an elected leader, in my view. Not to give them too much power, but to give them the ability to persuade other people that that's the right way to go. So coming back to the benefits of unitary. First and foremost, it gives complete autonomy to us. Policies can be honed and coordinated to solve the problems in Thanet. We have clear lines of responsibility in delivery of services. At the moment we have 2 councillors, one for this service, one for another service. How can the voter ever work it out? You know, why would they? It's not fair to them. They should have 1 councillor for everything. We have fewer councillors, and depending on the size of the authority, we would have fewer backroom costs. The benefits of the elected leader system, or the system I was suggesting, council committee system, is again, it's more accountable to the electorate, it's more accountable to the communities, greater transparency, less officer dominance, and much less party politics. It's got a lot going for it.
Here, here.
Thank you. Someone's still awake. Thanks, Lloyd. Right, so what are the areas of contention? Well, undoubtedly, there would be lots of negotiation required. If we were to succeed in getting sufficient support from the people to do this, and to do it quickly, we would still have to negotiate on a number of things. The size of the unitary. I don't have too much problem with the size of the unitary, except for 2 things, possibly. One is it needs to be as tight as possible to Thanet, because then the policies it generates will be Thanet-centric rather than Canterbury-centric or Ashford-centric, or be too diluted by rural issues. So I think, and also the decision making will be much closer to where the problems are, i.e. here in Thanet. So obviously there's room for negotiation, but I would die in a ditch over where it was based. It needs to be Thanet-centric. Secondly, the organisation of the council. Well, obviously the number of councillors would have to be up for grabs, the number of subcommittees, and lastly, of course, all their responsibilities. The responsibilities given to the elected leader on his or her own, given to the executive committee, the full council, the subcommittees, and also the scrutineers. So there's a lot to negotiate here. But the important thing is to break the bind we're in with TDC at the moment and to get a unitary. So I hear you say, how do we get there? Well, as I said before, there's no set route. So the route we take would probably be defined by the parties involved. And this would have to go forward on a cross-party basis. But essentially, the quickest, the most surest and the easiest route is to have 2 MPs in Westminster, okay? Because that would put unbearable pressure on local government to make these changes. If their sole mandate was to change government here, it would happen very quickly. Because whoever is in control in Westminster, they could see that these two constituencies would be very marginal, and they would not want to mess about with that, particularly if they're in a minority government. And then what would happen would be consultation with KCC and neighbouring authorities, and I forgot to put in the boundary commission, because the boundaries for district council would also have to be probably redrawn. Cross-party negotiation on the organisation, referendum on the new system, as I mentioned before, and I would also do, a referendum costs £100,000 to run, basically, in this kind of size district. So I would put in there a referendum on Manson at the same time. So if you're going to spend £100,000 having a referendum on the new system of government, you might as well put Manson into the pot and decide whether you want an airport as well. And we haven't had a referendum here on Manson. I'm very surprised by that, because it's such a politically divisive issue. And in my view, that's the only fair way forward. So do that at the same time. We then have to write a business case for the unitary authority, and the business case, of course, has to show that it will save money over a period of time. But in my view, the reason for doing it is not just to save money. The reason for doing it is a lot more important than just saving money. So I wouldn't mind if it cost a bit more money in the first few years, providing we get to have autonomy. And then we have to obtain cross-party vote for approval within TDC as it existingly stands. We submit the whole thing to Secretary of State for final approval, and then hopefully we get on and make the changes, have new local elections, and then start the local plan all over again. And I think that could be done in 2 years. If, however, we did not get 2 MPs, if we only got 1, for argument's sake, then all of that would have to be preceded with a petition in the constituency that did not elect an MP, just to make sure that the people are in that constituency are actually for this. That would be more of a courtesy than anything else. If, however, we got no MPs, then it depends on the level of support. If the number of votes exceeded 5%, I save my deposit, but that's not important because I've already written that off, just in case. But if we got 5% or more, then we should be able to trigger a referendum on this issue, i.e. local governance. And that would then, if it was successful, then we then go back to this process here. If, however, the support was less than 5%, then we're back down to having to have a petition first, then a referendum, and then this. Okay. That's why I'm saying to you, the more votes we get, the quicker and easier it is. And if we did not get an MP, i.e. we just got the 5%, it might not be fast enough to be able to stop the local plan process and start again. That's the problem. But as I say, it's all doable. And of course, if you don't get an MP, then you've got no political guarantees in Westminster either. So the question is, how could you guys help? Well, the first thing is that you've got to believe it. And if you don't believe it, then you're probably not going to help to achieve it. So part of what we're doing here this evening was an attempt to try and get you to believe that this is A, important enough for people to vote for, and B, it's achievable in terms of taking that support forward and getting it done. And I'm often asked about how serious I am. Well, I am serious. I am up for the fight. This is only the beginning. And am I willing to compromise? Am I willing to negotiate? Well, yes, of course. You always have to be prepared to do that. And let's not forget that if we got sufficient support, and again, I look at you guys here, will you support it or not? If we got sufficient support that the 2 main parties got quite anxious about how many votes we're going to take from them in this particular election, they might just come looking for some accommodation. Would I negotiate?